Hi, everyone. So let's discuss the American Republic. By the late 1700s, by 1783, the United States had achieved its independence. The Revolutionary War had come to an end. After the Battle of Yorktown, the British had, in effect, acknowledged American independence in practice, although the war went on for 2 more years. And the painting that you see on the screen right now is actually Evacuation Day, when the British leave New York City. They had a few holdout garrisons after the Battle of Yorktown. New York was one of them. You can see George Washington and the Continental Army coming into New York City, being greeted by the residents. So by 1783, the American Revolution is over. Uh, and now it's ultimately discussing what that independence is going to be between the Americans and the British that we're going to turn our attention to. Although this new Republic of 13 states had acquired independence across North America, the actual discussions, the negotiations of peace took place in Europe, in the city of Paris. Again, the Americans weren't just fighting alone. As the American Revolution continued, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, all host of European allies joined their side against the British Empire. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, when the Americans sit down to negotiate, they're going to try to pursue their interests, but also recognize that they weren't doing it alone. And so this is why the negotiations are taking place in Paris, although the Americans will, in effect, establish their own separate peace treaty with the British. The painting that you see there on screen is actually a painting of the American diplomats led by Benjamin Franklin. He's the guy there in black in the center, actually had commissioned to celebrate these negotiations, to celebrate what's called the Treaty of Paris, the treaty that's going to negotiate the United States independence from Great Britain, from the British Empire. But the British delegation wasn't willing to sit down, which is why you can see half the painting is incomplete there. But at the end of the negotiations, the British, and now we must call them the Americans in full, in practice, agree upon a few things. First is that the United States will have its independence recognized by Great Britain. This is a divorce, but it's going to be a divorce recognized by both sides and be as amicable as it can be. Second, is that all the territories west of what were once the 13 colonies, all the territories west of now the American Republic, the Ohio Valley, all the way to the Mississippi River, the Louis parts of the what becomes the Louisiana Territory. These are going to now be given to the United States. Benjamin Franklin asks offhand as well too for Canada. The British say no, but nevertheless, the Americans not only achieve independence but also an expansion of territory too. In return, the British request that those that fought on the side of the British Empire, about a fifth, about 20% of the British American colonists in the 13 colonies actually fought on the sides of Great Britain, or they were active supporters of Great Britain. Uh, some which did fight on the side of the British. That those loyalists who fought on the side of the British, many of which are expelled or driven from their homes during and in the aftermath of the American Revolution, many of them fleeing to Canada, that they be compensated for their losses in property. The Americans don't keep their end of the deal. In fact, the individual 13 states provide very little compensation to British American loyalists, but nevertheless, it's something that the Americans promised to. Also, as well, any pre-war debts that were owned to British merchants, any other business interests between the British and Americans, these should still be honored. And these, again, are haphazard. Some will be honored, some won't. As far as loss of life, tens of thousands will die during the American Revolution, but the majority of them will not die on the battlefield. In fact, more American soldiers will die in British captivity, often in prison ships off the coast, rather than on the battlefield itself. The British, too, suffer casualties, but it should be noted that when attempting to suppress this American rebellion or revolution in the eyes of the American uh, citizens, as now we must call them, the British government exercises restraint, attempt to engage in pitched battles, to respect the property and most importantly the lives of their subjects in North America. And so there are relatively few civilian casualties, not massacres or punitive destruction that might take place in response to rebellion. Also, too, is that as the American Revolution goes on, it becomes a global war, again, with the involvement of other European states and empires, like the French joining on the side of the American colonists. This means that battles will take place as a far afield in places like the Caribbean and in India, and of course in Europe, that will change the dynamic of the conflict. Something I think is notable as well, too, is that tens of thousands of Black American slaves in the 13 colonies will escape from captivity. They will join British lines, some fighting on behalf of the British. And when the British leave, when they evacuate their forces finally from the United States, they will take these tens of thousands of freedmen, once former slaves, but now freedmen, uh, with them to places like Canada, but also some to Great Britain as well too, ensuring their freedom, much to the annoyance of American slave owners. So our new United States that you see there in green, but also that area in beige that you see there further to the west that has been granted to the United States, has become part of the United States with the Treaty of Paris. Americans often discuss terms or mention terms like freedom and liberty, that these are American principles, and also the term democracy and a republic. But what exactly do we mean by these things? Well, I'll give you a short definition. Freedom is the removal of an oppressive state. One is freed from slavery, one is freed from tyrannical government or from a dictator or a tyrant. One is free to live their life as they choose. And yet is often implies an absolute, an uninhibited action. By contrast, liberty is the exercise of your freedom under the rule of law. If freedom is to be understood by an individual or to be the removal of an oppressive state, liberty is the exercise of your freedom in harmony with others, and ideally to the benefit of all, so that you can live and express your life in an ordered fashion and to live a good life. So, if you might, although this often Americans will talk about freedom, I think liberty is an important concept too. And if you were to talk to early American revolutionaries, patriots as they would dub themselves, if you were to talk to the early members of this American republic, they would find that concept of liberty central to their new republic, that they are, on one hand, free people, but at the same time, they're going to exercise their freedom under the rule of law in harmony with others around them. A republic is a representative government. It is where the public, the people, are represented, that's the RE, are represented by elected officials. A democracy is where a majority of the citizens, again, in a republic or in a democracy, a person is not a subject like under a king or a queen, again, who just simply has to obey the monarch. But in the idea of a republic or a democracy, the idea is that it is governed by the people, by the citizens. And in a democracy, these citizens are not just simply represented, but they actively participate, perhaps a majority actively participate in governance through the voting process. So that's the idea, or I should say, a distinction between a republic and a democracy. In a republic, the people are sovereign, in which there are representatives that act on behalf of the people. And in a democracy, it's not just simply that the people are represented, but they actively vote, they actively participate in their own government. So every republic is not a democracy, but every democracy is a republic. There's something important that happens in the aftermath of the American Revolution, too, as this new United States of America is established, is that in the months after independence, the US government is being operated under what's called the Articles of the Confederation. This is written during the American Revolution. It's a document in which as its name might imply, it's the state governments, this confederacy, not a strong national government, but ultimately 13 state governments that effectively are running this American republic. And unfortunately, these under the Articles of Confederation, the United States of America struggles to fund the Continental Army, and this is an issue throughout the entire American Revolution. George Washington is often struggling to pay his troops. He will at times pay them out of his own pocket, but he really struggles to receive funds from the Continental Congress, from this national government that's leading this revolution, to pay his soldiers. And now, with the war over, many of these soldiers are disgruntled, and in particular, many of the officers as well too. They agree in March of 1783, many of these disgruntled officers, as part of the Continental Army, to meet in a tavern in Newarksburg, New York, to discuss their grievances that they have with the American government, and to perhaps find some sort of remedy. There's discussion of perhaps even a march on Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress is, perhaps a military takeover, a military coup to seize control of the government. George Washington, commander in chief of the Continental Army, hears news of this. And when the meeting takes place in Newarksburg, New York, he arrives unannounced. He appears at the meeting, and he asks his officers to have an opportunity to speak to them. And of course, he is their leader, so they grant him that permission. He walks to the podium, and as he reaches it, and reaches into his pocket, he does something that his officers have not seen him do before. He reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a pair of spectacles, glasses, and he pulls out a speech to his prepared remarks to speak to the officers. But as they see George Washington reach into his pocket, the officers realize that their commander in chief, the man who has led them through this conflict and war for more than 9 years, is an old man. And he says, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." And in an instance, the officers realize that although they certainly have grievances and complaints with how the Continental Congress has not paid them or their soldiers, uh, that their leader, George Washington, has been sacrificing shoulder to shoulder with them in defense of this republic, in defense of the rights and liberties of the American people. And any discussion of perhaps marching on Congress is dissuaded, no longer goes forward. In many ways, George Washington is acting as an example of civic virtue. There is a later march by the General Army on Congress in the later summer of 1783. But George Washington's example really acts as a guide to his fellow officers to prevent perhaps a military coup taking over the American Republic early on. And he does something as well too, George Washington, that most military leaders don't do in new states. He hands over the reins of power with the American Revolution over, with the War of Independence over. He hands in his commission and he returns back home to Virginia, to Mount Vernon, seemingly having done his civic duty. And this ideal of George Washington is going to act as a shining example early on in the American Republic. He's seemingly seen as the ideal of a good citizen. See, in a monarchy or in a kingdom, when you have a king or a queen, for a kingdom to run well, all you need is that good monarch. Again, kingdom is decided by how that queen or king wants to call the shots. But in a republic, what matters is a good people. And George Washington is seemingly an example to his fellow American citizens now, that he exemplifies patriotism, self-sacrifice, not pursuing power or gain for himself, but simply trying to serve others. Yet, despite George Washington's example of civic virtue, the early American Republic faces challenges. Like I mentioned before, it operates under the Articles of Confederations, under a document that ultimately grants power to the individual 13 states, not to the national government that manages all 13 states. So, as far as the laws, taxation, currency that's operating in the United States in its early years, these things are all managed at a state level. There are 13 different currencies, 13 different state tax codes. Again, still today, we have different tax levels, often at a state level, and the laws of the land are by and large determined at the state level. Well, the American population, uh, upon independence, is more than 2 million, and tens of thousands of these American citizens can vote. They can vote in the Democratic, what I'll call the Republican process of the United States, because in this new American Republic, it's the states that decide who gets to vote. And in fact, the criteria is often tied to land. If you're on a certain amount of land, each state can decide if you can be a voter and elect members to your state assembly and elect members as well too to the new national government. Yet soon, very early on, it becomes clear that there are problems under the Articles of Confederation. It was also clear too that there's a problem with this slide. It should say one state, one vote, and interstate trade for our first bullet points there. Uh, but some of the challenges under the Articles of Confederation is first and foremost is that it is unable to pass national legislation. uh, Laws that apply across all 13 states. And this is because for major laws to be passed, there has to be unanimous agreement. All 13 states have to agree if they're going to pass any legislation. Further, as well, too, there's disputes over interstate trade. Uh, all 13 of the states of the United States of America have gone into debt to help fund the Revolutionary War and to help pay back this debt rather than ultimately raising taxes on their own citizens. That would be unpopular. They try to raise taxes on goods being imported or exported from state to state. This often means they're trying to shift their tax burdens onto their neighboring states rather than pay it themselves. Also, as well, too, uh, many other foreign states realize quite quickly that it's quite easy to do business with one state or another playing North Carolina off South Carolina or Virginia off Maryland to find the best trade deal for the Dutch Republic or for France. And this means competition between the 13 states as well too. At the same time, many of the British frontier forts out in the Western territories that the United States has acquired uh, remain under British control. And this is in part because the Americans did not compensate loyalists for their property losses. And this is in part because the Americans were resentful because the British did not return uh, escaped slaves or freedmen back to their former owners in the American Republic. And so the British decide they're going to hold on to their frontier forts in the Western territories. And this is a challenge to American sovereignty that the American Republic is unable to respond to. It seems as the years pass and as this young republic gets a little bit older, that their confederation of these American states is in decline and unable seemingly to operate. And one indicative sign of this is something called Shays' Rebellion. In the state of Massachusetts, the same state where the first shots were fired during the American Revolution, Daniel Shay and a series of other Massachusetts farmers rise up in rebellion against the Massachusetts government. Why? Well, many of these Massachusetts farmers uh, were Continental Army soldiers, fought in the Revolution, had left their farms for years, and when they returned back to their farms, they struggled to earn a living, make a living. Again, they had been in debt; they had not been working their businesses for years, uh, and they find that as they go deeper into debt and are unable to pay back their loans, that their farms are being repossessed, seized by the courts. And in response, Daniel Shay and these fellow Massachusetts farmers decide to rise up and force the courts to close. That's actually the image that you see there on the right. Daniel Shay and these fellow farmers ultimately preventing court from being held. So again, the property can't be seized and the farmers can keep their farms. Ultimately, Shay's rebellion is put down by the state of Massachusetts, but nevertheless, it's a warning sign across the American Republic of the inability of the federal government to deal with crises as disputes take place between the various states, as foreign affairs seem to challenge the national government, and as Shays' Rebellion takes place, the national government is nowhere to be seen. Yet, even as Shays' Rebellion is happening, it seems like there's a bright spot in America's future as well, too. There is a young man called Alexander Hamilton who sees under the Articles of Confederation that the United States is weak and seemingly disunified and needs perhaps a new organization if it's going to continue to function and grow. And he decides, Alexander Hamilton's the guy there that you see there on the right, he decides to team up with George Washington, who's retired to his plantation on Mount Vernon, to try to resolve a trade dispute between Maryland and Virginia. This conference, presided over by George Washington, but masterminded by Alexander Hamilton, proves to be so successful in resolving the dispute between Maryland and Virginia that as news of Shays' Rebellion reaches Virginia, spreads across the United States, that Alexander Hamilton proposes that there be a national meeting to amend the Articles of Confederation in the largest city at the time in the United States, Philadelphia. And he calls on representative delegates from all 13 states to come to meet in Philadelphia to discuss how perhaps the Articles of Confederation can be revised. And also he hints as well, too, that George Washington will be there to preside over this meeting. And so in the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states arrive in Philadelphia. They arrive in the city to discuss perhaps a revising of the Articles of Confederation. However, very quickly, it becomes clear as the delegates meet that perhaps more drastic action is needed. Perhaps the articles should be reformed entirely, should be tossed aside entirely, and a new document, a new contract to govern over these 13 states, a new constitution should be convened. And so, what's known as the Philadelphia Convention takes place in the summer of 1787, in which these, I want to say they meet in Independence Hall, but I can't guarantee it. But where they meet in Independence Hall, they lock the doors and prevent the press or the public from knowing what's being discussed. But they discuss not just simply reforming, but fundamentally changing the American Republic under a new document, what we now know today as the Constitution. The primary architect of the plan that becomes the US Constitution is James Madison. He's a Virginian, like George Washington. And he proposes, under his Virginia plan, a new, stronger national government, a new, stronger national government that, at one hand, will have greater powers, but at the same time will still respect the powers of the states as well, too. This is the idea of a federal government. A federal government, guys, is a government that has both a national government, but also state governments as well, too, that share jurisdiction over the governance of the people of a nation. And James Madison reasons that with these 13 states, he has to find a way or design a government which will serve the interests of all, and yet at the same time lead to a strong enough national government to pursue the interests of all. How does this work? Well, James Madison proposes that, in contrast to the Articles of Confederation, there should be two houses. That under the Articles of Confederation, there was a legislative branch. There was a body that would pass national laws, but James Madison decides that not just simply having a legislative branch, that'll remain the most powerful branch because it creates the laws, but this legislative branch should be divided into two bodies. rather than just simply having one state, one vote in the legislative branch. He proposes that each state should, on one hand, have in this bicameral legislature have two representatives. So regardless of size, whether it's a big state like Virginia or a small state like Rhode Island, that in the upper house, in the Senate of this legislative branch, that each state should have two representatives, two senators. At the same time, there should be representation based on population. So with this idea of a two-branch legislator or a bicameral legislature proposed by James Madison, a Congress, a Congress to pass laws. For any law to be passed, it has to be passed both by the Senate, in which each state has two representatives, and it has to be passed by the House of Representatives, in which each state is granted a number of representatives proportionate to their population. So big states like Virginia have more representation in the House of Representatives. Small states like New Jersey have less representation. But for any law to be passed at a national level, it ultimately has to be passed by both the House and by the Senate. It can start in either house. Again, there could be a law proposed by the Senate. If it gets thumbs up by the Senate, it can then go to the House, and if it gets the thumbs up by the House, and that it can go forward as well too. Vice versa. To actually see that laws are enforced, though, at a national level, Madison also proposes that there be a new executive branch that executes, that enforces the laws, led by what will later by an executive that we'll later call the president. Third and finally, Madison proposes that this new national government under the U.S. Constitution should have its own court system, the federal judiciary, what today we commonly know as the Supreme Court. But again, these federal courts, guys, spread across all the nation. And this Virginia plan will be the foundation for what is the U.S. Constitution. However, even though this plan is put forward, it's influenced by the New Jersey plan too. There's ultimately compromise that takes place. The Virginia plan may be the primary pillar, but it's not the only one by which these founding fathers put together what becomes the U.S. Constitution. There's also something as well too that's mentioned in the Constitution about how to determine populations of these states, particularly when it's tied to the question of slavery. This American Republic sees itself as founded on liberty, and yet that reality of slavery still remains in what's known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. For those Americans that are slaves, they are counted as 3/5 of a human being towards the total population of the state that they reside in. This is to give slave states greater representation based off the number of slaves they have, even if they are not considered voters or even citizens. And just to help you visualize this a little bit better, this is a good diagram that shows you how the U.S. federal government under the Constitution works. Again, our most powerful branch of government, ladies and gentlemen, is the legislative branch that you see right up at the top there. It writes the laws. It ultimately has the power of the purse. It controls the money. This is our most powerful branch of government. And again, control of Congress is shared by the House of Representatives, where each state is granted representation based off population, and by the U.S. Senate, where each state is granted two representatives regardless. Again, for a bill to become a law, it has to receive a majority of votes in both houses for it ultimately to be presented to the president, who might veto it, but ultimately will sign it off, and then it will become a law. The executive branch that you see there on the left, again, is the president, who can propose laws, but ultimately the primary purpose of the president is to enforce, to execute the laws, and to provide external protection. So again, the president of the United States is both on one hand the enforcer of laws, federal laws, across the U.S., but at the same time, the president is to provide protection to the United States. For the U.S. Supreme Court, it is ultimately to adjudicate federal laws, and its roles will evolve over time. I'll jump the gun here and mention that in time, the Supreme Court will assert its authority to claim the right to determine what laws are constitutional and unconstitutional. Important ruling there by this U.S. Supreme Court. Even though the U.S. Constitution is created in the summer of 1787 by this constitutional convention in Philadelphia, the reality is it still needs the approval of the American people, a majority of the American people. And for the members of the Constitutional Convention, they set the goal is that 9 out of the 13 American states have to ratify, have to approve of this Constitution before it comes into effect. And it becomes a great national debate amongst the American people about who will support this new Constitution and who are opposed to it. For those that are supporters of it, they dub themselves Federalists. They support this new national government that is strong, but at the same time also shares power, perhaps equally with the states as well too. For those that are opposed to this new, stronger national government, they take up the title anti-federalists, who are perhaps suspicious of having a more stronger national government. To persuade the American public to support the idea of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison write a series of papers that they release to the press and they become widely read, known as the Federalist Papers. And here's one excerpt, here's one quote from one of the Federalist Papers, in which Alexander Hamilton and James Madison argue in favor of this new national government, saying, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Again, this is really quite profound thinking by Hamilton and Madison. They're saying, look, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, there would be no need for government. Again, who would want to have a government again if we were all perfect angels? But because human beings are not angels, and because we haven't found angels yet to govern over us, uh, perhaps the best way we can establish a government to protect the liberties and the rights of people is one that ultimately shares power and has controls and mechanism by which this power can be shared. Under the Articles of Confederation, it seems like this early American republic is struggling to manage trade, to deal with foreign threats, to deal with internal rebellions like Shays' rebellions. And so Madison's and Hamilton's argument is that by adopting the US Constitution, the United States can better maintain its security, maintain order and peace, and therefore better promote liberty and freedom for the American people. He also used propaganda cartoons like this to sort of represent the idea of the US Constitution, that strengthening the bonds between the individual states will be beneficial to all. And they launch a great public campaign here. You can see that little small ship that Hamilton is having wheeled through the streets of New York City to try and rally up support for the US Constitution in the aftermath of the convention. And for more than a year, the debate takes place across the United States, but ultimately it is the supporters of the Constitution, the Federalists, that win out and win a majority of the US states, 9, ratify the Constitution. By 1789, our first national elections under the US Constitution will take place. Why did the Federalists win? Well, they have a well-defined goal and perhaps a more unified movement compared to the anti-federalists who are divided and while might have differing opinions about perhaps revising or changing the Constitution or just staying out of the Articles of Confederation, they don't have a unified goal like the Federalists do to rally their flag around. With the US Constitution ratified, the first national US government is elected. Elections take place to elect members of Congress, again, both representatives of the House and senators of the Senate, but also, too, the United States elects its first president. And presidents of the United States are determined by the Electoral College. Today, members of the Electoral College vote as the majority of their state population votes for it during the national elections. But in the early American Republic, these electors elect who they think is going to be perhaps the best man to lead, and they are not beholden to a popular vote, either directly or indirectly. And they choose to elect George Washington. They elect George Washington as the first president of the United States. You can see him being sworn in there. on Wall Street in New York City. The U.S. national government first is located informally in New York and will later relocate to Philadelphia. So there's no Washington, D.C. yet, guys. That's to come into the future. But in part to pacify the anti-federalists, to bring them on board with this new national project of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison and the other Federalists agree that some of the first laws that these new United States government under the U.S. Constitution will pass will be amendments, will be what's informally known as the Bill of Rights. That will be amendments added to the Constitution that guarantee rights to Americans across the Republic. There is sort of a question about this, how the Constitution works. Do these rights only apply at a federal level, or do they apply at a state level as well too? Well, that's open to debate then, and a question early on in the Republic that many Americans wonder. But I do want you guys to see on screen here these first rights guaranteed by the federal government to all Americans. The first being what's under the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, freedom of consciousness too. That Congress will make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, the right to assemble and to petition the government for redress. These are the basic principles of the First Amendment. So freedom of consciousness, believe as you wish to believe, freedom of speech, say what you like, freedom of association, to meet with people and to petition the government with problems that you have. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Again, an amendment that faces great debate today, but it seems clear that during the early republic, it's not just simply freedom of conscience, but the right to bear arms as well too. To defend those rights is seen as something that is guaranteed under the Constitution. The Third Amendment deals with no quartering of troops. It goes back to the Revolution when British troops were garrisoned in private homes. The Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Amendments all deal with criminal justice. And this is important for all Americans to know their basic rights. That if you are detained by the police, that if they're going to search your property, whether it's your vehicle or your home, that they have to produce a warrant, a right of assistance, a legal document issued by a judge granting them permission to search your property for whatever reason that might be, and to have reasonable suspicion to do so. Under the Fifth Amendment, if the police enter into your home or are searching your property, whether it's your vehicle or your backpack, and they find something and they say, "What's this?" You have the right to remain silent. You have no obligation to testify against yourself. And so keep that in mind as well, too. It's one of your rights guaranteed under the Constitution. The Sixth Amendment deals with the right to a speedy and public trial. Again, if a search warrant is issued, you exercise your right to remain silent. You are accused of a crime, and it is a serious capital crime. You have ultimately the right to be judged by a jury of your peers, by 12 of your fellow citizens, to determine your guilt or innocence, and perhaps the punitiveness of the punishment that you will receive based off that. The Eighth Amendment says that if you are found guilty, that you should not face any cruel or unusual punishment for whatever infraction or crime that you've committed or that you've been found guilty of by the justice system here in the United States. The Ninth and Tenth Amendments are rather interesting stories as well too, but I'm going to put a pause on them because I've been going on a bit now with you guys, so take a look at them. Something important, though, that happens in the early American Republic is not just simply the creation of the U.S. Constitution, but also that early on, individual American states had their own state religions. So, for example, the state of Virginia, it was the Anglican Church, what's today known as the Episcopalian Church here in the United States. And in places like Massachusetts, to become a voter, there was a religious criteria. You had to be a Congregationalist, a member of the Puritan Church, to be a voting citizen. Yet, early on in the American Republic, these religious criteria to become either a voter or for there to be a state religion, these start to disappear and become abandoned. And in part, this is part of the separation between church and state that the founding fathers adhered to. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson actually write against religious assessments stating the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. It is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right. And it's not just simply writing, but actually argument. Madison and Thomas Jefferson win the day with. So again, religious criteria and state-sponsored churches are quickly dismantled in the early American Republic. Yet, what is being built is a new national government under George Washington. What's interesting as well, too, is although legally under the Constitution, this new federal government has greater powers, in practice, it's not much more powerful than it was before. Again, a small government is a weak government. And it means if you have a weak government, it can't really terrorize or be tyrannical to the people by intention. George Washington, as well, too, when he becomes the first executive, adopts the title of Mr. President. This is a world of your highnesses and your majesties. It's a rather humble title for George Washington to adopt as leader of the nation. Yet, nevertheless, it suits him well. And he has a team with him. Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State. Secretary of State handles foreign affairs. But the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, certainly dreams, and he's the guy that's standing there in the back of this first cabinet. Again, the members of the executive that manage the federal government. Alexander Hamilton is intent on strengthening this national government to strengthen the United States, and he has a plan about doing so. You might remember that I mentioned all the individual US states had debts, outstanding debts, money owed from the American Revolutionary War. Alexander Hamilton goes to the states and offers to assume those state debts and to wrap it up into a single national debt. The states all agree to this. Sounds great. Yeah, you take our debts and pay them off for us. That sounds wonderful. But how is Alexander Hamilton why is Alexander Hamilton doing this? Or why might debt be a good thing? Well, Alexander Hamilton reasons that as a new nation, the United States needs to build up its credit score. Again, if you're someone who takes loans and pays them off always regularly, again, you build up good credit. With good credit, then when you need money, you can get it and spend it for whatever you need it for, and to ultimately keep your company, your individual, or in this case, a nation growing because it has a steady flow of finances. Whenever it might need money today, it will be able to pay it back tomorrow. Alexander Hamilton quite cleverly reasons, though, that if the United States takes on a national debt, this is going to strengthen the authority of the national government. Why? Because for some way or another, it's going to have to pay off that national debt, and to pay it off, it's going to have to raise taxes. Hamilton also reasons, too, that the United States should honor the paper money that it issued during the Revolutionary War, what were called continental dollars. Again, no one knew during the Revolutionary War if the United States was going to win its independence or not. And so while many soldiers were paid in continental dollars and might have passed them off to middlemen, pennies off the dollar, because they weren't sure if they were actually going to get fully compensated for them, Alexander Hamilton decrees that under this new constitution that the United States will honor the continental dollars issued during the revolution at face value, reimbursing those investors that held on to them. And this is again to strengthen the authority of the national government, to make it seemingly a good financial bet. To go along with Alexander Hamilton's plan, there has to be political compromise. Thomas Jefferson and many of other Americans are a little bit suspicious of Alexander Hamilton and his plans of turning the United States into this strong, financially oriented republic. And to see that this legislation is passed, that the United States assumes a national debt, that it reimbursed the continental dollars, an agreement is made to move the U.S. capital, to move the U.S. government, the U.S. federal government, from Philadelphia to what today is known as Washington, D.C., to a part of Virginia that the state of Virginia gives up, grants as the national capital, as the District of Columbia. That's where the D.C. is from Washington, D.C., to see that the national capital is established in the South, in part so that Southerners in particular can keep an eye on the federal government and make sure that it's not perhaps too strongly influenced by the finance and commercial interests of Philadelphia and New York City. And this is a profound separation that still remains to the present day. Many countries, their capital city is both the political, financial, and cultural center of their nation. In the case of the United States, though, Washington, D.C. is our political capital, but New York City is our financial capital. To pay this new national debt that the United States has assumed, Alexander Hamilton sees that Congress passes one of our first national taxes, the whiskey tax. This is a tax on whiskey, as the name might imply. Again, alcohol may not be a necessity, but nevertheless, it seems like a good reasons Alexander Hamilton to put a tax on. And for many whiskey producers, distilleries, and particularly in upstate Pennsylvania, when they hear news of this first national tax that is going to affect their lives directly, they rise up in resistance and what's known as the Whiskey Rebellion and refuse to pay the tax, drive out the tax collectors, drive out the national government's representatives. And in response, George Washington assembles the U.S. Army, marches to upstate Pennsylvania, and faces no resistance. The rebels disband. They no longer resist. They, in practice, agree to pay to the tax. And crucially, this event of the Whiskey Rebellion solidifies the authority of the U.S. national government. So, in comparison to under the Articles of Confederation, where things like Shays' Rebellion proved a national crisis, in face of the Whiskey Rebellion, George Washington puts down bloodlessly this resistance to the federal government's authority, maintaining the unity of the United States, encouraging Alexander Hamilton and Congress to pass even more legislation, passing and creating a national bank, creating the U.S. Mint. But for those that are a little bit concerned about the increasing authority of a strong national government like Thomas Jefferson, who says Congress may go home, Mr. Hamilton is all powerful and fails at nothing he attempts, they fear that the growing power of the national government may prove in the future a threat to American liberties at an individual level and at a state level. And this debate between the authority of the US government and its relationship to the states and to the people is something that's going to go on through much of early American history, and that we won't get a resolution until the end of our class. So I will see you guys again